It's been a really interesting process getting ready for this, sort of reflecting on books that seem appropriate at a time like this. And this one's certainly been an influence, as has the man himself. So it'd be really nice to know if any of you have, you should let me know if any of you have actually read Stewart Brand's The Clock of the Long Now. I don't know, is it a book many of you know? Could let me know in your comments. I was aware of his work as a student with the Whole Earth catalogue. I don't know if any of you have seen or read that. It's this enormous, great big tome that he brought into the world in the 60s and 70s, a way of bringing together knowledge, and I think that's his main project. And then after that, I was aware of his book, How Buildings Learn, that wonderful discovery as a student that somebody really was getting your language, not obsessing over finely crafted architectural photography ad infinitum, but actually looking at how people occupy space, how they live, how they really absorb and change architecture, and how the buildings learn with their uses. And that for me was just a revelation that somebody was capturing the process of life in architecture rather than just this product. And I think that's just been a search that has intrigued me and many people who I have an affinity with, rather than just being obsessed with this singular entity of architecture. And also just this idea that architecture can be about more than just the buildings, that it's the spaces in between, it's the strategies and the diversity around it. Well, it's rolling up to 9 o'clock, so I suppose I should begin sort of doing a proper introduction. Well, first of all, I'd really like to say a big thank you to the Architecture Foundation and to Alicia for inviting me to do this. It's great to talk about this extraordinary American thinker who really was, it's extraordinary. I really, really ask you to go and look him up just to see what Stewart Brand's background has been and his influence. And I suppose the reason why I've chosen this book of The Clock of the Long Now is because it seems a really, really important book to read now. As there's a quote that says, a book for all time that reminds us that civilizations are built over long periods of time based on past decisions taken with a long view towards the future. So in effect, our lives play out in a world that runs at many paces. And I think that's so important now. We're all kind of just, reacting very much in the immediate to what's going on around us, and we really need to contextualise it over a series of different scales. And perhaps I should explain in advance that in the book, the time is not in traditional millennia, but is in tens of thousands of years, really asking us to look at that long period. So I think I'm going to dive straight in and let you enjoy this wonderful book as much as I do. Enjoy your story and do feel free to fall asleep. You can catch this on the YouTube channel afterwards. If you miss it. So I'm going to read just two very small chapters, brief chapters from this book. It's easy to read. I could happily dive into many of them, but here's a good place to start. This is called The Order of Civilization. In civilization with long nows, says Brian Eno, you feel a very strong but flexible structure, built to absorb shocks and in fact incorporate them. One can imagine how such a process evolves. All civilizations suffer shocks, yet only those that absorb shocks survive. This still does not explain the mechanism, however, of how it's able to do this. In recent years, a few scientists, I forgot to say this is from 1999, so it's a full 21 years ago, In recent years, a few scientists have been probing a similar issue in ecological systems. How can they manage change and how can they absorb and incorporate shocks? The answer appears to lie in the relationship between components in a system that have different change rates and different scales of size. So things changing at a different rate across different scales. Instead of breaking under stress like something brittle, these systems yield as if they were malleable. Some parts respond quickly to shock, allowing slower parts to ignore shock and maintain their steady duties as system continuity. The combination of fast and slow components makes the system resilient, along with the way the differently paced parts affect each other. Fast learns, slow remembers. Fast proposes, slow disposes. Fast is discontinuous, slow is continuous. Fast and small instructs slow and big by a crude innovation and occasional revolution. Slow and big controls small and fast by constraint and constancy. Fast gets all the attention, slow has all the power. All durable dynamic systems have this sort of structure. It is what makes them adaptable and robust. Consider, he goes on, for example, a coniferous forest. The hierarchy in scale of pine needle, tree crown, patch, a stand of trees, a whole forest, and then the scale of the biome is also a time hierarchy. The needle changes within a year, the tree crown over several years, the patch over many decades, the stand over a couple of centuries, and the forest over 1,000 years, and of course the biome over 10,000 years. The range of what the needle can do is constrained by the tree crown, which is constrained by the patch and the stand, which is of course controlled by the forest, which is controlled by the biome. Nevertheless, innovation percolates throughout the system via evolutionary competition within lineages of individual trees, dealing with the stresses of crowding, parasites, predation, and weather. Occasionally, large shocks such as a fire or disease or human predation suddenly can upset the whole system, sometimes in a way, all the way to the biome level. The mathematician and physicist Freeman Dyson makes a related observation about human society. The destiny of our species is shaped by the imperatives of survival of 6 distinct timescales. To survive means to compete successfully on all 6 timescales. But the unit of survival is different in each of the 6 timescales. On a timescale of years, the unit is the individual. On a timescale of decades, the unit is the family. On a timescale of centuries, the unit is the tribe or nation. On a scale of millennia, the unit is culture. On a scale of eons, the unit is the whole web of life on our planet. Every human being is the product of adaptation to the demands of all 6 scales. That is why conflicting loyalties are deep in our nature. In order to survive, we have needed to be loyal to ourselves, to our families, to our tribes, our cultures, our species, our planet. If our psychological impulses are complicated, it's because they are shaped by complicated and conflicting demands. In terms of quantity, there are a great many pine needles and a great many humans, many forests and many nations, only a few biomes and cultures, and but one planet. Considered operationally rather than in terms of loyalty, I propose 6 significant levels of pace and size in the working structure of a robust and adaptable civilization. From fast to slow, the levels are, and this is where, if you look on the Instagram tweet that we provided, there's a wonderful arced diagram that Brand has produced in this book of The Long Now. The first is fashion and art, then commerce, infrastructure, governance, culture and nature. And I'll go through these one by one as he sets out in the text. In a healthy society, each level is allowed to operate at its own pace, safely sustained by the slower levels below, and kept invigorated by the livelier levels above. Every form of civilization is a wise equilibrium between firm substructure and soaring liberty, wrote the historian Rosenstock Huey. Each layer must respect the different pace of the others. If commerce, for example, is allowed by governance and culture to push nature at a commercial pace, all supporting natural forests, fisheries and aquifers will be lost. If governance is changed suddenly instead of gradually, you can get the catastrophic results of revolutions. In the Soviet Union, for example, the government tried to ignore the constraints of culture and nature while forcing a 5-year plan at an infrastructure pace onto commerce and art, thus cutting itself off from both support and innovation. The USSR was doomed. We can examine the array layer by layer, working down from fast and attention-getting to slow and powerful. Note that as people get older, their interests tend to migrate to the slower parts of the continuum. So guys, speaking out of the text here, that's why young people like Instagram, that's fast-paced and instant, obviously, and the older generation like gardening, or as we find ourselves as architects, we suddenly find landscape architecture rising to the fore more than ever before. Back to the text. Culture is invisible to adolescents, but a matter of great concern to elders. Adolescents are obsessed by fashion, elders bored by it. The job of fashion and art is to be froth, quick, irrelevant, engaging, self-preoccupied and cruel. Try this, no, try this. Culture is cut free to experiment as creatively and irresponsibly as society can bear. From all this variety comes driving energy for commerce. For example, the annual change in motor cars or phone models, and the occasional good idea or practice that sifts down to improve deeper levels, such as governance becoming responsive to opinion polls, or culture gradually accepting multiculturalism as structure instead of just grist for entertainment. Commerce. If commerce is completely unfettered and unsupported by watchful governance and culture, it easily becomes crime. Gosh, that's so true. As in some nations and republics, and current day circumstances, I add, after the fall of communism, he says. But I think we know that happens is very true today. Likewise, commerce may instruct but must not control the levels below it, because commerce alone is too short-sighted. One of the stresses of our time is the way commerce is being accelerated by global markets and the digital and network revolutions. The proper role of commerce is to both exploit and absorb these shocks, passing some of the velocity and wealth on to the development of new infrastructure, at the same time respecting the deep rhythms of governance and culture. Onto infrastructure. This is essential as it is and cannot, essential as it is, it cannot be justified in strictly commercial terms. The payback period for such things as transportation and communication systems is just too long for standard investment, so you get government guaranteed instruments such as bonds or government guaranteed monopolies. Governance and culture must be willing to take on the huge costs and prolonged disruptions of constructing sewer systems, roads and communication systems, all the while bearing in mind the health of even slower natural infrastructure such as water, climate and so on. Education is intellectual infrastructure, so is science. Very high yield but delayed payback. Hasty societies that cannot span these delays will lose out over time to societies that can. On the other hand, cultures too hidebound to allow education to advance at infrastructural pace also lose out. Governance. In the realm of governance, the most interesting trend in current times, beyond the worldwide proliferation of democracy and the rule of law, is the rise of what is coming to be called the social sector. The public sector is government The private sector is business, and the social sector is non-governmental, non-profit, do-good organisations. Supported by philanthropy and the toil of volunteers, they range from charities, local land trusts and disease support groups to global players like the International Red Cross or the World Wildlife Fund. What such organisations have in common is that they serve the larger, slower good. The social sector acts on culture level concerns in the domain of governance. One example is the sudden mid-20th century dominance of historic preservation of buildings, pushed by such organisations as the National Trust for Historic Preservation in America and the National Trust in Britain. Through them, culture declared that it is okay to change clothing at fashion pace, but not buildings. Okay to change tenants at commercial pace, but not buildings. Okay to change transportation at infrastructure pace, but not neighbourhoods. If some part of our society is going to speed up, these organisations seem to say, then others are going to have to slow way down just to keep the balance. Even New York City, the most demolition-driven metropolis in America, began to preserve its downtown. On to culture. Culture is where the long now operates. Culture's vast slow-motion dance keeps century and millennium time. Slower than political and economic history, it moves at the pace of language and religion. Culture is the work of whole peoples. In Asia, you surrender to the culture when you leave the city and hike into the mountains, travelling back in time to remote village culture where change is century-paced. In Europe, you can see it in the terminology where the names of months, described by governance, have varied radically since 1500, but the names of signs of the zodiac, culture, remain unchanged for millennia. Europe's most intractable wars are religious wars. As for nature, the final layer of pace, its vast power, inexorable and implacable, continues to surprise us. The world's first empire, the Akkadian in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, lasted only 100 years. It was wiped out by drought that went on for 300 years. Europe's first empire, the Minoan civilization, fell to earthquakes and a volcanic eruption in the 15th century BC. When we disturb nature at its own scale, as with our extinction engine and greenhouse gases of recent times, we risk triggering apocalyptic forces. Like it or not, we now have to comprehend and engage the still longer now of nature. The division of powers among the layers of civilization allows us to relax about a few of our worries. We should not deplore rapidly changing technology and business while government controls cultural mores and so-called wisdom change slowly. That's their job. The total effect of the pace layers is that they provide many levelled, corrective, stabilising feedback throughout the system. It is precisely in the apparent contradictions of pace that civilization finds its surest health. So I think hopefully that made sense. That's the kind of general sort of layering, and it's a brilliant device. And in the book, he goes on to look at the importance of phenomena such as slow science, the fact that you can't get results quickly, which, again, in the current climate, the haste and urgency of what we're dealing with is necessary, but we know the best results come over time. And then there's a most extraordinary chapter about the generational view and the interrelationship we have as human beings on the planet, and that we really have to understand that we're on the point of such shifts in terms of the way our generations work. The majority of human history, for example, across the globe, the average age of life expectancy has been, until this century, 10 years. That's the average life, whereas now it's 76 years and even 82 in Britain at the moment. Such incredible change over a short period of time. So I'm going to just sort of conclude by reading the final chapter I'm going to cover, which is, somebody's just asked if I could repeat the name of the book. It's called The Clock of the Long Now by Stewart. And he's talking about taking a much longer view of things, but also understanding the different paces that are working across. So one of his final chapter, heading towards the end, is about the long view. So I'll just read that before, because I've done 15 minutes so far. I'll have a sip of tea to keep me going. Caught up as we are these years in the whirligig of time, our attention deficit order and our technological obsession with it ever tinier and ever faster, how do we keep up with its pace and at the same time perceive outside it? Supposing that occasionally taking the long contemplative view is indeed a good thing, where do you stand to get one? One authority, Dr. Gregory Kahete, a Tewa Indian from the American Southwest, has this advice. The elders remind us of the importance of the long view when they say, look to the mountain. They use this phrase to remind us that we need to look at things as if we are looking out from the top of the mountain, seeing things in a much broader perspective of the generations that are yet to come. They remind us that in dealing with the landscape, we must think in terms of a 10,000, 20,000 and 30,000 year relationship. End quote. One day in the late 60s, humanity found itself atop a new peak, the moon, viewing Earth and Earth's history from an altitude of 240,000 miles. That also, incidentally, is the cover of the Whole Earth catalogue that Stewart wrote. It turned out that for the astronomer Fred Hoyle was right when in 1947 he had forecast, once a picture of the Earth taken from outside is available, a new idea as powerful as any in history will be let loose. In those photographs from the moon, we saw fractured humanity's home as itself unfractured and whole, and we began to see what the Tewas saw from the mountains, a relationship measured in millennia. This insight will keep being renewed as space tourism develops, perhaps in the decades to come. Well, this was 20 years ago, and thankfully we still haven't got to that point, Stewart. The environmentalist René Dubos also was right, quote, "We are becoming planetized, probably almost as fast as the planet is becoming humanized," end quote. Our global influence and our global perspective are almost keeping pace with each other, which is fortunate. It could have been otherwise. Once we acknowledge our new responsibility for the health of the planet, the large view and the long view become one. And here's one of Stewart's phrases: the big here and the long now merge as the long here, which is no longer just occupied but managed by what might be called the long us. And the Chinese have a term for it, Da Wo, big me. There are other vivid points of perspective in the long us. Religions collect and protect many. Kevin Kelly reported on a visit to the Greek peninsula of monasteries known as Mount Athos. It was a very remote, very stable, very conservative, very much still working. There's maybe 24 different monasteries, all breathtaking in their architecture and setting. I'd have to say it was the most timeless place I'd ever been. You couldn't tell what century it was at that moment. The monasteries house and feed you, men only, if you show up. That's their rule. Those mills, with the monks in their full hooded garb, by candlelight and in complete silence, were stories in themselves. I don't know what drew them to that place, but they were running the best time machine I know of. Reader, asked Stewart, what was the occasion of your longest view? Communal time has been the norm over most of human history, says anthropologist Steve Barrett, and individual time only came in with the European Enlightenment. I knew a guy in South India, Barnett remarked, who looked across the fields and told me that his ancestors had been farming there in that place for 3,000 years. He knew his ancestors back for at least 8 generations. Long here, long us. The slow stuff is the serious stuff, but it is invisible to us quick learners. Our senses and our thinking habits are turned to what is sudden and obvious to anything gradual, and oblivious to anything gradual. Between the near impossible win of a lottery and the certain win of earning compound interest, we choose the lottery because it is sudden. The difference between fast news and slow non-news is what makes gambling addictive. Winning is an event that we notice and base our behaviour on, while the relentless losing is a non-event, inspiring no particular behaviour, and so we miss it as the real event, which is that to gamble is to lose. What happens fast is illusion. What happens slow is reality. The job of the long view is to penetrate illusion. How can we see the insidious transformations of our own day? Slow science is part of it. Applied history is part of it. And every year there are more sophisticated tools of macroscopic vision. A video going the rounds of the conferences, this is back in 1998, I presume, shows the accelerated growth of the human population on a world map. The sudden overwhelm in the last few seconds shock. I know field biologists who can look at a hillside and see the advance of scrub growth over failing meadow. Look at a wide valley and see the river lashing like a snake within its floodplain. Hopefully I've come back on. Slight virgin internet moment there. Maybe I'll just start that paragraph again. I know field biologists who can look at a hillside and see into the future or the past the advance of scrub growth over failing meadow. Look at a wide valley and see the river lashing like a snake within its floodplain, the meander loops progressing downstream and flicking off oxbow sloughs to either side. Look at a terminal moraine like Cape Cod and see the glacial ice advance and then withdraw over the landscape to a 100,000-year beat. This kind of ability is made of knowledge absorbed until it becomes perception. And it's definitely something I should say architects really need to pay attention to much more than they do. Back to Stewart. Prolonged observation and deep perspective is something we assign to institutions. They aggregate human effort and are expected to handle such durational tasks as noticing slow, important change. Even some corporations, commerce hasty as they are, do it. Responsible lumber companies farming their wood over 70-year cycles, insurance companies with their century-scale actuarial tables. But governments and universities are the main institutions we charge with caring for the long view. And this, I might say, is where there's a big disconnect between expectations 20 years ago and the reality of today. So, to continue. Governments, owing to their level of responsibility, universities, because of their duties, are to intellectual heritage and the ever-new generations passing through. The great advisor on institutional management, Rosebeth Moss-Kanter, notes, people care about their place in history when their own past is valued. People take the long view when they perceive leaders are trustworthy. They take the long view when they believe the rules of the game are fair. They believe they will share equitably in the returns. They take the long view when they have a deep understanding of system dynamics. They see the connections between actions in one place and consequences in another. They see, or I might add, should see, therefore appreciate, so they can or should, therefore appreciate the need for indirect long-term investments, whether research and development, infrastructure repairs or education, etc. Kanter concludes, quote, people take the long view when they feel a commitment to those who come after them. They care about posterity, their children and other people's children, and therefore see the need for actions to benefit the distant future. That's the end. I could go on. So, do we actually believe today that it is only institutions who should and could and can take the long view? Are governments, universities and the providers of infrastructures actually up to it anymore? Surely we need a revolution in that department. I really strongly advocate that you go and read this book. It's really influenced my practice. I now use it as a design tool. Any design that I come across, and in the studio, as I said earlier, if you didn't catch it, Tom Greenall from DSJHA was the person who introduced me to this book. And we now use this as a way of looking at our work, our spatial strategies across architecture and urban design and landscape and infrastructure, a way of cutting through the chaos of the city and society, the environmental and the social and the economic. So I'm going to finish there. I'm very happy to take questions if you wanted to drop me a line or follow up this interesting conversation. Great to see you. Have a good evening, good night, and thank you so much.